Your children to Children's Church today. The nature of our topic that we're going to be discussing today from the book of Judges is sort of an adult-themed topic. So I want to encourage you to send your kids to Children's Church. While they're being dismissed, if you'd take your Bibles, please, and open to Judges chapter 19. We're going to continue this morning with our study on the book of Judges. I started this some time ago before we went on the Czech Republic missions trip, way before that actually. We've had a few breaks as I've covered a few topics related to various either holidays or different themes. But today I would like to conclude with the final remaining chapters, which contain some really horrific accounts of some very violent and vulgar type of things. And so I'm not going to read through the remaining chapters. We're going to look at chapters 19 through 21. It would take too long to do that. Instead, I'm only going to read selected verses as we go through it, and I'm going to try to retell the story in a shortened version. And as I do so, try to get at what I think the author is trying to get at, to convey the main point of what the author here of the book of Judges is trying to convey. Now, before we do that, though, I want you to think a little bit about how people react sometimes when you talk about the moral law of God. Have you ever talked to anybody about the Ten Commandments and notice what kind of reaction that you get in the process? Now, if you're talking to believers, hopefully you get a positive reaction. People that feel, oh, the Ten Commandments, they're good. They're good. They're not how we get to heaven, but they're good laws. They're good moral rules by which to govern one's life. And hopefully believers will agree with you on that. But oftentimes when I talk with unbelievers, with people who don't know the Lord, and you talk about God's laws, and especially when you talk about the Ten Commandments, there's almost a resistance there. It's like, I don't want anybody telling me what to do kind of attitude. Have you ever encountered that? I have. And I oftentimes wonder why. Why would anybody not like the moral law of God? I mean, think about it. Now, some of those, if you're an atheist, okay, I have no other gods before me. I can see the first couple of commandments which concern themselves primarily with the worship of God and that forbid idolatry. Okay, I can see somebody thinking, well, I don't really like that. But what about the rest? I mean, 6 of the commandments have to do basically with the way that we treat others, with our relationship with others. And so what is there not to like about, say, for example, not stealing? How many of you like people to steal your stuff? Raise your hand. Nobody. So why would anyone find that offensive? That just baffles me. I wish everybody would follow that particular law of God. Thou shalt not steal. But we know we live in a world where that's not true. In fact, just a week ago, I think it was after we got back from the Czech Republic, my neighbor came over and she asked if we had seen anybody take a package off her front porch. Apparently, she had ordered something on Amazon.com. It was school supplies for her kid, and somebody stole the package off her front porch. School supplies. Now, I don't think they knew what was in it, but you get something for your kid, and boom, it's gone. Just this past weekend, my son-in-law was patrolling our neighborhood. His patrol area is it's sort of neat that it's in our neighborhood as well as the church, and so he's on the night shift and he was patrolling, and he saw a young man at about 3 in the morning pushing a motorcycle through the neighborhood. Well, that just looked kind of odd, pushing a motorcycle through a neighborhood at 3 in the morning. And so he turned around and he went back, and by the time he got back to the young man, the motorcycle was gone, and he was walking down the street. And I hope I'm retelling this correctly. Joel is actually doing some overtime work right now, so he's not here this morning. But anyways, he told us the story, and so he comes back, and the young man had actually ditched the motorcycle in between 2 houses and was pretending that he didn't have one. And Joel said, hey, I just saw you pushing what are you doing out at 3 in the morning? And he said, nothing, I'm just walking home or something. And, well, where's the motorcycle you were pushing? What motorcycle? I don't know what you're talking about. And so he looks at, anyways, the bottom line is the motorcycle had been ditched in between 2 houses, and it turns out that the kid was pushing home a stolen motorcycle. And I feel bad for the owner of the stolen motorcycle. He's actually South Florida, so this kid didn't steal it, but he got it from somebody else that had stolen it. And so, who doesn't like the idea of, hey, don't steal? I can't understand anybody not liking that. Or thou shalt not murder. And I understand sometimes people get mad with somebody and would like somebody to, eliminate them. But usually that's just in our thought life, and we don't want to go that far, right? We repent of that at one time or another. But most of us like the fact that, hey, thou shalt not murder. Or what about adultery? How many of you want somebody messing around with your wife? I'm glad nobody, that's the old Simon Says game. Simon Says. I'm glad no one raised. How many of you want somebody messing around with your husband? No. For the most part, now I know there are some weird arrangements today, weird marriages, and some kooky things that go on, but for the most part, we don't want somebody sleeping with our wife. We don't want somebody sleeping with our husband. So what is there to dislike with thou shalt not commit adultery? Why do some find that so offensive? And on the list goes. But the bottom line is, people oftentimes don't want to be bound by any type of moral authority. And so we not only depart from the moral rules, but we also depart from the moral lawgiver, from the authority behind the rules. And what's amazing is when this happens to God's people, when it happens to those who are God's people. In the Old Testament, that was the nation of Israel. In the New Testament, it's us, the church. And I'm amazed that when we get to the book of Judges, now we got glimpses of this as we've done our study through Judges, but just how bad things had gotten in the nation of Israel at the time of the Judges. And chapter 19 and 20 and 21 relay some events that happened at this period of time in the life of Judges, that after we talk about these events, you'll be thinking, how in the world could God's people ever live like this? How could they have strayed so far from what God desired of them? And so let's take a look at Judges chapter 19 through verse 21. And as we do so, think about the fact that these people they've already fallen into what I call a black hole of a moral abyss. They've fallen into it. Maybe you and I haven't fallen into it. Maybe our culture hasn't quite fallen into it yet. But I think we're getting closer and closer to the edge. You know what I mean? You can get real close to the edge without quite falling in yet. And if we haven't fallen in, we're certainly close to falling into the same kind of moral conditions and climate that we see here in the book of Judges. The story begins with an act of violence, and actually a horrific act of violent behavior toward an individual. When you open the curtain on Judges chapter 19, there are two people on the stage. There's a member of the tribe of Levi. He's a Levite. He would be probably a priest, although it wasn't required that all Levites were part of the priestly family, but he could be old enough that he's retired at the age of 55. Priests retired and were no longer involved in the temple service, or in this case with the tabernacle. Some of them had more menial duties in relationship to the tabernacle. We don't know exactly what his occupation was, but the bottom line is he's a Levite. And he has a concubine. Now, a concubine was sort of a legal wife. This is something that wasn't endorsed by Scripture or by God, but it was something that the Israelites had adopted, I think, from the pagan nations around them, where polygamy had become the practice. And what would often happen is they would have a wife that would be eligible for an inheritance. She would be a regular wife. That would be the person he would marry, with the idea of when he dies, he leaves his stuff to her, as well as to his children. A concubine was a legal wife that did not enjoy rights to the inheritance. She got nothing when he died. And basically, they were a little better than a slave. They enjoyed a status a little better than a slave, but they were a little worse off than a wife. And oftentimes, most people believe that probably the reason why most men had concubines was really for sexual gratification. That these were women who could service his sexual desires. And so, the wife may not want to do that all the time, and so they would have these concubines that would serve for in that kind of capacity. And in this case, what we see is that this particular concubine had been unfaithful to her husband. That doesn't tell how often, it doesn't tell with who or any of the circumstances about it, just that she had been unfaithful, and she had gone home to her father's home, and he goes after her. Now realize this too, in most cases, concubines were purchased. They were bought with some sort of dowry, with some sort of gift. They would go to the father of the woman and say, hey, I like your daughter and I'd like to buy her from you. I'll give you 3 camels and 1 sheep. No, 3 camels and 2 sheep. 3 camels and a sheep and a half. Anyway, they would barter back and forth, and they would purchase the woman. And they were basically considered their property. It was a little different than things are today. And so he goes to get her, and he goes back, and for some reason the father shows him a large amount of hospitality. Every time the Levite wants to leave and go back home, the father of the concubine convinces him to stay for another day, and so he stays for another day, and finally he says, hey, we got to leave, we got to go home. And so toward the end of day 5, the Levite and his concubine head for home. But it's late in the day, so they don't get very far from Bethlehem. And remember, they didn't have street lights in those days. Traveling at night was dangerous, not only in the sense that you could trip over a rock, you could fall off a cliff, or you could be robbed by bandits. And so there were multiple reasons for not traveling at night. So it's getting late in the day, and they look for a place to stay. When it's time to turn in, the Levite's servant, he's got a servant with him, suggests Jebus, which was the city later to become Jerusalem, but at this time it's occupied by Canaanite people, and it's a pagan city. And so the Levite says no, he doesn't want to go to Jebus. He doesn't want to go to this place where there may be foreigners that won't treat him well. He wants to go to a city that's inhabited by Israelites, his own people, because he trusts that his own people will treat him better. And so he says, no, we will go to Gibeah. Now, Gibeah was a city occupied by the tribe of Benjamin. And he thought apparently that they would treat him better, but what a surprise this man is in for. In fact, in chapter 19, verses 14 through 15, we read this. It says, so they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah and Benjamin. There they stopped to spend the night. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them into his home for the night. Everybody ignores him. He goes to a place where people are actually related to him to some extent. They're of the same nationality. They're of the people of God. They ought to be showing hospitality. And he goes to this city rather than the city of the foreigners, and everybody ignores him. Now, I think there's a reason why they ignored him. I'll talk about that later. I think it was a purposeful thing. But nobody shows him any kindness. And you say, well, no big deal. If a stranger was sitting in the town square, I wouldn't invite him into my house either. Well, things were different in those days. There were no motels. There was no Holiday Inn. There was no Days Inn. There was no Ramada Inn. People that were traveling depended upon the hospitality of others for their lodging. And so in this particular situation, he's hoping that somebody will offer him a place to stay, but nobody does. That is until an old man comes out near the evening. And the old man invites him into his house, along with his servant and along with his concubine, because he didn't want them to spend the night in the square. And it soon becomes apparent why. After arriving at the old man's home, there was soon some men of Gibeah. Now these are the people of God. These are Benjamites, individuals from the tribe of Benjamin. There's some men from Gibeah that are pounding on the old man's door. And they're not pounding on the door to ask for a loaf of bread. These wicked men demanded that the old man bring out the Levite, not the concubine, but the Levite, so that they could have sex with him. Now this tells me that the people of the city may not have offered him a place to stay on purpose, because also in the ancient world, not only did you depend upon the hospitality of someone for your lodging if you were traveling, but when that person extended their hospitality, they also were promising you their protection. They were saying, we will defend you even if it means our life. And I'm going to guess that some of the citizens of this city that may not have been homosexual, maybe they all were, but we got this old man that's not, so I have to believe there's a few that aren't. But they may have been aware of what would happen. They may have, maybe from past experience or maybe just from putting 2 to 2 together, that they know that if they pledge their protection to somebody, if they say to this Levite and his concubine and his servant, yes, you can come and stay in our house for the night, now I've got to defend him against the wicked men of this city, and we know there's going to be trouble tonight. I'm going to guess that the reason why, maybe in part, and I'm reading into things here, so I may be wrong, but I'm guessing that maybe in part the reason nobody offered him a place to stay was they foresaw trouble. And there was trouble. And so these men, these wicked men, are pounding on his door saying, bring out the Levite so that we can have sex with him. Now the old man was horrified by this request, but he does something that may horrify you even more. In an attempt to provide hospitality, and I believe in an attempt to protect his guests, he offers the wicked men that are pounding on his door of Gibeah, he offers them his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. Now, I don't know that he had authority to do that, so I'm going to guess that he may have talked with the Levite, and the two of them conspired together, yeah, let's do that. And you say, man, how revolting. Yeah, remember, these are God's people. These are not pagans. These are Benjamites. These are the people that Moses came down out of the mountain with the 10 Commandments of God in hand and delivered to the people. These are the same people that received all of the law of God that we have that's recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. And this is the way that they're acting. You may think, this story sounds a little vaguely familiar, and it does, doesn't it? Because it reminds us of the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, where the men of that city, at least they were pagans. The men of that city demanded that they turn over the angel so that they could have sex with the angel, not realizing that the angel was an angel. And so here the old man pleads with the wicked men not to do such an outrageous thing. But the narrator goes on to tell us in verses 25 and 26 that his plea is ignored. It says, but the men would not listen to him, so the man took his concubine and sent her outside. That is the Levite. He sends his concubine outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. Now you may be thinking, how could a Levite no less, do such a horrible thing to turn over his concubine to these wicked men? I mean, it seems to me, and maybe to you, that he should have grabbed a couple of swords and jumped out the front door and started slicing people up, right? Defending the woman. Do the Bruce Lee thing, whatever that's like. I don't know. We'll get Ryan up here to show us. That's what I would think. I would hope that I would do that if some wicked men were pounding on my door. I wouldn't be saying, here, take my wife. I mean, you'd have to be pretty displeased with your wife to do something that sick, right? I would like to think that I would, even if it meant, even if I was they're big Arnold Schwarzenegger type guys and they're outside and there's 10 of them, that I would at least go out and be willing to die to protect my wife. Not here. Now the Levite gives up his concubine. And you say, why? Why would he do such a thing? Well, let me give you some possible reasons for why he did such a thing. They're not excuses for his behavior. It just shows you the moral state to which Israel had sunk at this particular time, but there may be some factors that may have caused him to rationalize this kind of behavior. First of all, he may have thought, well, what's the possibility of defeating these guys? If I go out, it may mean that they'll kill me, they may kill the old man, and they may take the virgin daughter and my concubine. And it's going to be a lose, 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 lose situation, a win only for the wicked men of Gibeah. And so maybe he just felt like, the odds were too great. And so he turns over one person instead of maybe two, and maybe it not resulting in the death of some others. It may also be that he considered the fact that, and we don't think this way, but the ancient Israelites did, that this was a woman that he was turning over to them. And women were seen as little better than personal property in those days. I mentioned that is not correct. That's not the right way. That's not the way that God's Word teaches that we ought to view women. That was a cultural thing. I've often said that it is Christianity that has elevated the status of women to being equals with men. But even in ancient Judaism, women oftentimes were seen as just a little bit better than personal property. And so it was a little easier perhaps for him, not that it's right, but easier for him to turn over his concubine. Remember as well, she was not a full-fledged wife. She's basically a sexual servant for his personal needs. And she had been unfaithful. Maybe he still had a little bit of grudge. Yes, he went to get her because she belonged to him, but maybe he's thinking, you know what? She was unfaithful to me. Here, guys. Boom. Tosses her out the door. I don't know. I don't know what he was thinking. Or it could have been that he actually had noble reasons and that, again, he turned over his concubine with the idea that at least this way he could protect the old man's virgin daughter. And so maybe there were some noble reasons. Whatever the reasoning or lack thereof, the Levite turns his concubine over to the men, who then violently rape her throughout the night. At daybreak, the woman crawls back to the house where her master was staying. Actually, she goes back to, she doesn't crawl back, but by the time she gets there, she falls down at the door, and there she lays until daylight. I hope the story starts to break your heart a little bit as you think about this poor woman and realize what is happening here, and that these are the people of God that are now living this way. A selfish and self-centered, pleasure-seeking, perverted society. Hopefully you feel like you want to rescue her. She's been severely abused. And you think, well, what's her master going to do now? And the scriptures tell us what her master does. Look at verses 27 and 28. It says, when her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, get up, let's go. What a caring guy, right? What a caring guy. Get up, let's go. But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. I can even see him kicking her a little bit. You know, hey, wake up. We got to go. I don't know. It doesn't say that. He puts her on his donkey, takes her home. When he gets home, he does something that's even more cruel in the minds of many, something very cold-hearted, something that is shocking and sickening, something that is unthinkable, even to the other fellow Israelites. In chapter 19, verses 29 through 30, it tells us that when the Levite got home, when he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb. That's why I told you, send the kids to children's church. Cut her up limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, such a thing has never been seen or done, nor since the day not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Think about it, consider it, tell us what to do. So this disturbed all of the other Israelites too. I mean, they had sunk into a certain depth of moral depravity, but they're looking at this event and they're saying, this is like the worst of the worst. How could anybody do such a thing? Now, before you totally freak out over what the Levite did, realize the woman was already dead. Because when you first read through this story, if you don't read far enough and you end a little too soon, you're going to think that that he cut her up while she was still alive. That would really be sick. But according to chapter 20, verses 4 and 5, he refers to her as being murdered. And so the abuse that she suffered actually ended up killing her. But it's still a really revolting thing what he did, dismembering her and sending her out to the 12 tribes. But there was a reason for that. He meant for it to be revolting. He meant for it to get the attention of the other tribes so that they would do something about this terrible thing that had been done in the nation of Israel. Basically, he's trying to rally the troops. And he does so. But the problem is the troops are out of hand. The problems are the troops don't have any moral guidelines either. And so this one event is just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, which is what we see in life, isn't it? I mean, you see a family today, and it starts maybe with the husband starting to drink. And his drinking turns into a drinking problem. And before long, his drinking problem begins to affect the way that he treats his wife and affect the way that he treats his children. And now maybe there's violence in the home and abuse. And then that tends to get worse. And then the kids get in trouble in school. Then they get in trouble with the law. And before long, you got just this chaotic mess of one problem leading to a bigger problem, of leading to a bigger problem. And so you got this whole dysfunctional mess that everybody maybe sits back and wonders, well, how in the world did it get that way? It all started with one behavior. And what you're going to see here is that this one event of these wicked men abusing this woman ends up resulting in some terrible catastrophes for the nation of Israel. Some horrific things. It just gets worse and worse. In fact, what we see in chapter 20 is that war breaks out. It worked, what he did, dismembering his concubine, sending her body parts throughout the 12 tribes. It rallied the troops, and it tells us that there were 400,000 soldiers that gathered together before the Lord at Mizpah, and they came ready to punish the person or the people responsible for this wicked thing done to this woman. The outcome of this assembly is a decision to give the city of Gibeah what it deserves. But when the Israelites send messengers throughout the land of Benjamin to call for the wicked men of Gibeah to be handed over, what do you think happens? So you got 400 soldiers ready to march against one of the 12 tribes, against their own kinsmen, against the Benjamites. They send some men and say, hey, give us those wicked men that raped that concubine so that we can punish them like they ought to be punished. Now, I would like to think if I was one of the members of the tribe of Benjamin, I'd say, yeah, okay, you're right, man. What they did was absolutely wrong. They deserved to be punished. Hey, guys, let's go find those wicked men and help our fellow Israelites out in doing away with in executing justice, if you will, on these evil men. That's not what happens, though. It says that the Benjamites refused to hand over the guilty or wicked men. Instead, they rally their own troops. And instead of saying, we'll help you to find these guilty men and punish them as the law of God demands, they decide to defend their guilty men. And they actually go on the offensive. It says that they have 26,000 swordsmen and 700 soldiers who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And the results are devastating. The 12 tribes, or the other 11 tribes, seek God's advice on who should go up against the Benjamites first. And God says Judah. Judah goes up against the Benjamites. And on the first day of battle, the Benjamites, the bad guys, cut down 22,000 Israelites. They cut down 22,000 of the guys that are trying to execute justice. And remember, meanwhile, all the time, they're defending these people that have committed this horrific crime against this woman. Then there's a second day of battle. On the second day of battle, the Benjamites have victory again, and they cut down another 18,000 Israelites who lose their lives in fighting against. And so basically you've got this little civil war going on. And so far you've got 40,000 soldiers that have died because the Benjamites refused to do what was right and turn over the wicked men who had done this horrific thing against this concubine. You got evil men defending evil men. Do we ever see anything like that today? To make a longer story short, we end up seeing on the third day a great reversal, which takes place as the children of Israel go before the Lord and they fast and seek the Lord's face, and they cry out to Him. The Lord promises them victory. The Israelites use an ambush. They lure the Benjamin troops away from the city of Gibeah. Then they burn the city and everybody that's there. They put them to death, men, women, children, anybody that was behind. It's too late for anyone to do anything. The people of Gibeah flee, and at the end of the day, 25,000 of them have also been slaughtered, with only 600 Benjamites surviving. And they flee to the wilderness. So almost the whole tribe of Israel is exterminated. Almost 100,000 people, by the time you add in the women and children, almost 100,000 people are now dead because of the act of these wicked, selfish, self-centered men who want to fulfill their own pleasures and rape this woman throughout the night. And it has escalated and escalated and escalated. And more people have gotten involved and more people have died. That's what happens with sin. That's what happens when we depart from the moral precepts of God. When we go our own way and do our own thing. It would have all ended if the people of Gibeah would have just turned over the bad guys. I mean, some of them would have been put to death. Maybe a handful. I don't know. It doesn't tell us how many men there were. Maybe a dozen people would have died. 100,000 though? And innocent women and innocent children? In Leviticus chapter 5, verse 1, it says, if anyone sins because they do not speak up when they have a public charge to testify regarding anything that they have seen or learned about, then they will be held responsible. That tells me that God expects us to testify when we have the opportunity to testify against something that's been done that's evil, something that's wicked, something that's an injustice, something that's criminal in nature. In school they call it tattletaling. Well, guess what? The Bible teaches we ought to be tattletales. We ought to tell on people who do wrong. A lot of times people in our society are afraid to do that. They're afraid of repercussions. They're afraid of reprisals. They're afraid to call the police on the bad people because they're afraid the bad people will come back and do something to their home while they're not there or while they are there. And we can't be that way. I think it was Edmund Burke that said, all that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. All that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. We're supposed to do something. They should have handed over the guilty. They didn't, and the problems escalate. In Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20, it says, the one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. In other words, you punish the wicked and the evil, you punish the perpetrator, but you don't kill the innocent with the wicked. But what did they do? They went in and they killed women and children in the process. Now you say, but hey, wait a minute. Didn't God tell them to do that? No, not here. The only place where we see that in the Old Testament is during the conquest period, where apparently the Canaanite people had become so wicked, they were to be exterminated if they didn't leave. This is not one of those situations. This is where the Israelites decided they were going to do this on their own, and in the process they almost eliminate the whole tribe of Benjamin. In fact, they do eliminate all the women. Apparently there are no women left for the men of these 600 soldiers that survived and fled into the wilderness. And what happens is the people, the other Israelites, realized what they had done in this mass slaughter of all of these people and in this civil war that's taking place between the tribes, and they cry out before the Lord and they say, why has this happened? That one tribe should be missing from Israel today. Well, I can tell you why it happened. You guys just took matters into your own hand, and you went out and you punished the innocent with the guilty. Their outrage turns to grief, and for the third time in this story, the people are weeping. They realize in this moment that one of the tribes is in danger of disappearing. The Benjamites have been wiped out, except for 600 warriors. And now what can be done? They're saying, what can be done to preserve this tribe, their kinsmen? Now the story gets really bizarre. Now it gets really bizarre. So basically, they come up with a scheme for 600 wives. Now they had made 2 vows which prevented them from just giving their own daughters to the Benjamites in marriage. They made these vows at mitzvah. The first vow that they made was that they would not give any of their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites. So they couldn't just say, here, take our daughters and marry them so that the tribe of Benjamin can continue. They didn't want to break that vow. Even though it was a rash vow and maybe not even a good vow, they didn't want to break it. The second vow they had made was to kill anyone who did not assemble at the assembly where they decided to go to war against the people of Gibeah. And so what they realized is that they began to research things, is that there was one particular city where no one from that town had showed up for battle. It was the town of Jabesh Gilead. And so they said, well, guess what? We made a vow that we would kill anybody that doesn't show up, that doesn't have representatives at least, that doesn't have any warriors that come to do battle with us. And so they go to the town of Jabesh Gilead and they kill everybody in the town except for the virgin women. They kill men, women, and children. The only ones they leave alive are the virgin women. And they end up with 400 wives for 600 of the Benjamites. That's how they get wives. And you think, this is crazy. Go, you slaughter a people, another town, another village so that you can get wives for these people because they don't have wives because you just killed all of their wives. But they still need 200 more, so they got to come up with a solution. Where do we get the additional 200 women for these 200 warriors of Benjamin that don't have wives now? Well, there's apparently some sort of festival that's taking place, and the girls of Shiloh are going to go out and dance, and apparently these girls that went out and danced during this festival were virgins, unmarried women. And so what they do is they tell the Benjamites, listen, we've promised not to give you any of our daughters, so we can't give you our daughters. And we've already killed off the only people group that didn't show up for battle, and you got their 400 virgins that was left. We still need 200 more. I'll tell you what, hide in the bushes. Now I'm paraphrasing. Hide in the bushes. We can't give them to you, but you can kidnap them. Hide in the bushes. When the virgins come out to dance, you come out, you grab them, and take them home as your wives. And when their fathers come and complain to us because they weren't allowed to give them to you as wives, we'll say, hey, you're guiltless. You didn't give them to them. They kidnapped them. Wink, wink, wink. Right? They found a way around the vow they had made. They rationalized and planned and schemed like people do today. How can I get around doing what I told God I would do? And it's nothing new. And that's what they do. And that's how they get their wives. They kidnap them. So we've got almost 100,000 dead people because of this one self-centered, narcissistic, selfish act of these men pounding on the door of this old man. It leads up to the death of over 100,000 people, almost the extermination of the tribe of Benjamin, a whole town that's wiped out except for their virgin daughters, who are then given to these men without apparently any dowry or any other stipulation or condition, and then 200 ladies that get kidnapped and have no choice in the matter of having to be the wives of the rest of the Benjamites. Wow, what a place to live, huh? This is what happens when people forsake the moral law of God. And this is why it ends. If you turn to the last page of the book of Judges and look at the last verse, and you'll see a phrase that we've seen over and over again in the book of Judges. Look at verse 25. What does it say? In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Now you say, well, what role does the king have? And the king was responsible in Israel, in ancient Israel, for making the people obey God's laws. You remember when good kings later on in the book of Kings, when good kings would come on the scene, they would go and destroy the high places, the places of pagan worship. They say, you cannot worship pagan gods here in Israel. You must worship the one true and living God. And when wicked kings would come on the scene, they would build high places to pagan gods and encourage that kind of worship and the resulting lifestyle that goes along with that kind of worship. And so the author here of the book of Judges is mentioning the fact that there was no king to enforce the moral law of God, and so everyone simply did that which he saw fit in his own eyes. And the book of Judges ends with that. I don't know about you, but when I read a book or when I watch a movie, I like a good ending. I like it where the hero wins, where good triumphs over evil, where things turn out and you can finally see, oh, the end of the story is a good story. Even if there's some sadness, it's a good thing. Here it ends with 100,000 people getting wiped out and others besides that, some innocent people and women being given away and kidnapped and this moral muck of whatever. Everybody doing what they thought was right. Revenge, retaliation, going to extremes, not listening to what the Word said, but doing their own thing. It's what happens. I think the author ends on this note on purpose. It causes us to reflect. It causes us to reflect on the state of affairs for the nation of Israel, the people of God. How did they get here? How did they get here? Well, I tell you how they got there. By forsaking the law of God. By not caring about fellowshipping with the one true and living God. By not caring about loving Him with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and their neighbor as their self. You certainly don't see love for one's neighbor in any of these actions. I think it ends on that note as well for future generations. For everyone who would come along, including us who read the book of Judges, so that we can realize, so that the stark reality of what happens to a culture that forsakes the law of God, this is what happens. And by the way, that culture can be a big culture like the United States of America or any other country, or it can be a small culture. And by the way, I'm not just talking about belief in God. I'm talking about adhering to the moral precepts contained in the law. Like, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, and on and on. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And what we see is what we can decay into, the moral abyss that we can fall into when we depart from loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and strength, and our neighbors as ourselves. And it's not just for a country or a nation. It can be even in the church. Churches can fall into moral abysses, and we can see all sorts of problems in churches that results from people not adhering. And maybe our sins aren't as horrific as the sins that we read about here. Maybe they're a little less than that. Maybe it's just lying in front of our families so that our kids see the hypocrisy of our lives and they walk away from the faith. Maybe it's infidelity. Maybe it's cheating on your spouse. And again, a younger generation or an unsaved neighborhood watches and they read about it in the papers or they see it on the TV and they say, that's what the scandal with all the Catholic priests. And over 1,000 children? Over 1,000. You don't think that affects Protestant Christianity as well? Because a lot of people just lump us all into the same basket. And it's what happens. We can end up in our own moral muck. We can end up in our own moral abyss if we're not careful to seek to walk with the Lord the way that we're supposed to walk with the Lord. You say, well, Pastor Dean, this is really a depressing sermon this morning. Well, there is also a note of hope in the book of Judges. It's meant to make us reflect. That's why I think he ends that way. With this terrible, this is the most horrific story in the book of Judges. And it's got stuff in it, it's R-rated stuff, right? This is stuff you don't even want to talk to your kids about, some of it. And it ends on purpose that way. But there is a little ray of hope that we see as well that isn't necessarily right in the context of this passage, but is seen in the fact that God does not abandon these people. that these are still the people of God. And he still works with them. In fact, he really doesn't abandon them ever, but he does allow them to go into captivity some hundreds of years later when he allows Assyria to come in and take captive the northern 10 tribes, and then eventually Babylon, the southern 2 kingdoms, and they go into captivity for 70 years. But even then, God doesn't abandon them completely. He punishes them for what? For not obeying his laws, for not keeping his laws. He punishes them for 70 years. But then he brings them back to the land. He even promises them that ahead of time. God still works with these imperfect people. He doesn't abandon them, and that amazes me. And it gives me hope. Because I realize I'd like to think that my life is a little better than some of these people that I'm reading about here. Although Jesus revealed to us that, okay, you say you haven't murdered anybody. Have you ever been angry with someone without cause? Then what did Jesus say? You've committed murder in your heart. You say, I've never cheated on my wife. I've never cheated on my husband. I've never committed adultery. What did Jesus say? Have you ever looked at a woman to lust after her? Then you've committed adultery in your heart. So I don't want to be too self-righteous as I look at it. But the neat thing, I look at it and I think, wow, and God still, he didn't abandon them. I would have gave up on these people, I think. By the end of this story, I would have said, you know what? Hey, remember what I said to Moses? I was going to wipe out the Israelites and start a new group of people, a new family of God with Moses and his descendants. Do you remember that when he talked about that? I would think maybe this would be the perfect time to do that, but God doesn't. He still deals with them. We see his amazing grace, even in the Old Testament. God has always been a God of grace. He is not a mean demigod that took a delight in punishing people in the Old Testament, no matter what some of your liberal humanities professors may say in college. He's not a different God. The God of the Old Testament is not a different God than the God of the New Testament. They are one and the same. And he is always delighted in showing grace to people. And we see that even here as we look at the sad note that ends the book of Judges with the fact that God does not give up on his people still. However, let me caution you, never misuse the fact that God is a gracious God. Never misuse the fact that God sometimes doesn't make us suffer all the consequences of our sin. Sometimes we seem to get away with things. You know, the Bible says the goodness of God leads to repentance, and God has his purposes in all that happens. But never use it as an excuse to continue in sin. Never say, well, you know what? Nothing's happened to me yet. I'm just going to keep living this way. Well, my family's doing pretty well. My life's going pretty well. Things are going okay for me. I know I'm not living right, but hey, God's a God of grace, right? Woohoo, thank you, big buddy in the sky. Don't treat God that way. Learn from what happens here. Learn to walk with the Lord your God in fellowship with him, loving him with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, seeking to obey him in every aspect of life to the fullest of your ability, and to continue to do that all the days of your life. And I can guarantee this, life will go better for you as well. Look at what happens here. Life will go better for you, it'll go better for our church, and it'll go better for our culture if just you and I live the way we ought to live, because we're a part of that culture. We're a part of Grace Bible Church. We're a part of this nation. And if just you and I do what is right before the Lord, things will be better than if we don't. Let's pray. Father in heaven, there are some really horrific things that happen.